Welcome everyone, this is Kevin from the Yield Lab podcast. If you're new here, every week we invite fascinating guests to cover the topics of investing, entrepreneurship and well-being. Our guest today is Svanevik, co-founder and CEO of Nansen. So Nansen is a blockchain financial analytics platform. Your mission is to enable crypto investors to make informed decisions based on the highest quality data intelligence. You guys reach, I believe, a $750 million valuation within your first 2 years of business, which is remarkable to say the least. And you're still alive after this crazy 2022, which is even more remarkable. So in this episode, we'll talk about how you guys built an industry-leading Web3 analytics company in less than 24 months, why on-chain data matters, and why it will be even more critical in the future. Your thoughts on a crazy 2022. And last but not least, how to keep your personal life in check when you're working 24/7 in an industry like crypto. So ladies and gentlemen, before we start, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification to never miss one episode. And also keep in mind, of course, that nothing shared or discussed here is financial advice. So now that we've covered the basics, on to today's episode. So Alex, welcome. Someone would define you as a young, successful, yet pretty laid-back entrepreneur. The first time we met, you actually mentioned that you've moved quite a lot in your life. So why don't we start with some context about your background? So what are the key turning points in your life that define who you are today?
Sure, yeah. Good to see you again. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah, so my name is Alex. I grew up in Norway, Bergen, the best city in Norway, I should say. The second largest one on the coast out to the North Sea. I would say maybe the first major turning point in my life was when I decided to study music in high school, which I think my father wasn't too happy about. He wanted me to study like more science, mathematics, and so on. But I made my own kind of personal choice at that time, studied music. I played the guitar and got the chance to do everything from ballet to acting as part of a performing arts high school. And then later on, I went back to more science-related topics and studied cognitive science in university. The second major decision, I would say, was when I decided to move to Italy as part of Erasmus. You're also European, so you might have enjoyed some of the benefits we have as a result of the EU. Yeah. EU takes a lot of heat, but the Erasmus program, I think most people agree, is a success. So I spent 6 months living in Italy, learned Italian, living with 3 Italian guys there. That was probably the second major decision I made, which impacted who I am as a person. And it made me discover the joys of learning languages, working abroad, living abroad, and so on. And then later I moved to Edinburgh in the UK and studied artificial intelligence, took my master's degree there. And then lots of different things happened after that. I started my own company. I worked in management consulting for about 3 years, working with everything from seafood to luxury retail, and also banking, insurance, a few more kind of boring industries, if you will. Started working as a data scientist, later on data science manager, and then discovered Ethereum in 2017. Went down the rabbit hole like many other people did, and basically left my job maybe 6 or 9 months after that to go full-time into crypto. Moved from Barcelona to Hong Kong and built out a data team where one of the people I hired was one of my now co-founders at Nansen, Evgeny. Got laid off from that job as a result of the last bear market in 2018. And then spent about, I think, close to a year working with great projects like 0x, the decentralized exchange protocol. I worked with an incredible mobile gaming company in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, where I also met the Axie Infinity founders. And eventually ended up co-founding Nansen, arguably late 2019, went live in 2020. So that's a brief history of myself there.
Awesome. So can you just tell us back to this kind of art background? Like how did this impact you, open your mind to some things, basically?
Yeah. I do think that art and especially music. So music is very connected to mathematics, I would say, for example. It's a lot of music theory, kind of systems, trying to crack the code is something that always appealed to me with everything I do. So learning music theory, learning how to learn languages, which you, of course, are also quite adept at. You recognize
It's all logics.
Yeah, it's like logic and seeing patterns and then figuring out what's the most optimal way I can learn this thing. And then also, to some extent, maybe the magic kind of wears off a little bit once you crack the code and then you move on to learning something else. I would say music was an area where I didn't really have, for example, classical training in reading sheet music. So it's something I had to learn. Whereas in my class, like most people were adept at that. They were trained at musical theory, at reading sheet music. It's something I had to learn on the job, or in school. I viewed it as a puzzle that you have to solve and a skill or a muscle that you can develop. And so I think I've taken that mindset with me. It's the same thing learning about crypto. There are certain patterns, if you look at ICOs, if you look at NFT collections, if you look at lots of different phenomena in crypto, it's about pattern recognition, right? So I do think that has impacted the way I approach things, that there is always some kind of puzzle to crack. And there are always patterns that you can try to find, and that helps you a lot. Yeah. So I think it has impacted me in different ways.
So basically it's this thing of how can I deconstruct something, understand the kind of first principle and basics so I can be as optimize my learning and do this 2080 of being able to like master this thing, at least practice and be good at it.
Exactly. And so there are some people out there who, I think Tim Ferriss is probably the best example of someone who has dedicated his life to doing these different things at a much more consistent pace or in a consistent manner. He's managed to learn lots of different languages, become like a tango, I think, world champion or something. So, that mindset, even if you don't have to go completely wild and try to become the best in the world at these different things, it's a very helpful mindset, I think, to take with you in life and learn different things, especially in the information age when you have access to lots of different learning materials, and the learning how to learn is probably one of the best investments you can make, I think.
Is it something that you check very quickly when you want to work with people or when you want to hire people? Is it their kind of ability to deconstructing or like thought process on how to approach learnings?
Yeah. I just came back from a company retreat, our first company retreat with Nansen. And one thing that struck me while I was there, I hadn't really reflected on it so much before, was that many of the people we have at Nansen have very unique career paths where they have done very different things, actually. So people who have reinvented their own careers at least once, if not multiple times. And so when you see that in a more conservative environment, you might say that's a negative, that someone has changed their career path or gone from doing one thing to something completely different. You want to find someone who checks the boxes at a specific profession. But I think implicitly or subconsciously, that's always been a positive thing in my view. It shows that you have an adaptive mindset. You can learn new things. And it's hard to test for it in an interview, but definitely when people have a couple of years of experience and they've tried doing different things, I think that's a positive.
Yeah, especially if you look at yourself as an entrepreneur and founder and like all the different stuff that you've done before, there's no reason why other people should kind of the boxes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And as a kind of creator, like you've done all these different stuff. So you talked about discovering Ethereum in 2017. A lot of people in the space talk about discovering Bitcoin first. So can you tell us how did you start your crypto journey and how did you end up discovering and really getting intrigued and falling down this Ethereum rabbit hole?
Yeah, I did first discover Bitcoin in 2013. At least that's the memory I have of discussing it at length with someone. And like most people, I had these boomer arguments that it's only going to be used for money laundering and things like that. I didn't get it at the time. The context also here is that I am Norwegian. I grew up in Norway, which has a society that works well, a banking sector that works, a currency that's stable. So I didn't quite recognize that these things aren't things that you have in all countries around the world. But let's say 4 years later, when I discovered Ethereum, one issue I always had with Bitcoin was that how do you know that this is the currency that will take off? Maybe the technology makes sense, but how do you know that's the right monetary policy? How do you know that's the right instantiation of a currency, even if it is the first? That wasn't clear to me. With Ethereum, my sense was that this is a platform. So if someone's going to create the world's reserve currency in a digital form, it seems more likely that they will perhaps create it on Ethereum rather than it being Bitcoin itself. And so thinking of it from an investment perspective as here you can actually invest in the platform, that seemed like lower risk
Less
in a way.
risky, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Because you're not betting on one horse, you're betting on the stadium that has horses almost. So as long as people are making bets, you might do well. So that was, from an investment perspective, what intrigued me. Also, I was quite fascinated by the concept of permissionless innovation. I think by nature, I do value freedom a lot. And so the idea that anyone can create whatever they want and deploy it on Ethereum and there's nothing anyone can do about it is a very fascinating concept. And I think only later started to appreciate the sort of secondary effects of that. For example, composability, meaning you can create a money market platform or a protocol, and then I can build, say, a leverage trading or margin trading protocol on top of that, right? So you can like innovate on top of each other, and actually there's nothing you can do to stop me from innovating on top of what you have built, right? Because it's open source, it's permissionless. So there are a lot of these other attributes of Ethereum that I think still are very fascinating.
Yeah, the composability is a big factor. Actually, I think it's Mark Andreessen who says that composability is to software what compounded interest is to investing or something like that, basically.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense if you can represent yourself, like the power of the thing.
Because you get this exponential effect, just like compounding interest, right? You get those exponential looking curves. And if you look at the crypto space, that's what you do, right? You have this incredible pace of innovation. Of course, there's a lot of crap out there too, and mistakes that people make and all these different things. But the fact that you don't have to go and apply to get an API key or to apply for a license to start a bank or whatever, you just have this incredible pace of innovation due to the permissionless attribute of blockchains and also the composability that you get.
Yeah. So you discover Ethereum, and then you have basically, you say you're working for this company, you get fired, and then fast forward 2020, you basically start Nansen.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about Nansen and your mission, which is more relevant than ever in early 2023 after the multiple catastrophes and bankruptcies we witnessed last year.
Yeah.
That are basically due to the fact that all these companies were not really doing anything on chain. So you named your company after Fridtjof Nansen, a Norwegian explorer and scientist. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I would say there are two aspects to that. The first one is I view people in crypto as a type of explorer. So you have to be quite courageous. You have to be curious. And you have to move fast in order to succeed in the crypto industry, whether you're a founder or an investor or even users actually of these products. And so I quite like the metaphor of a polar explorer, someone who's going places where no one else has been before. That's what actually all of us are doing to some extent. And I also like that in the context of Nansen being almost like a compass or a tool that you would use as an explorer. And so if you look at our logo, the logo is actually, the inspiration for the logo is a compass. So I don't know if that's clear, but so that's the first part. The second part is that I do think Fritjof Nansen is an embodiment of those values that I mentioned, right? Courage, curiosity, speed. We also have transparency as one of the Nansen values. And so having someone who can serve as a role model for everyone, like in terms of human accomplishment. He wasn't only an explorer, he was also a diplomat, a humanitarian. He introduced what was called Nansen passports, where stateless refugees, 450,000 stateless refugees, were issued Nansen passports, which gave them the right to live in a specific place. He also convinced the then Prince of Denmark to become the King of Norway when Norway broke loose from the union with Sweden. So he did lots of interesting things, and he was he was a Renaissance man in many ways. Like, he did a lot of different things. So the explorer part is the first part that's interesting, but he's also just a fascinating person that happens to have a 2-syllable name, which is good for technology companies. You want to have a 2-syllable name. So yeah, that's the story of how we ended up calling it Nansen.
So can you tell us, why did you build Nansen and how did it really start?
Yeah. So the vision of Nansen is to create transparency in a tokenized world. So going back to some of the points we talked about earlier with permissionless, the permissionless nature of blockchains, I fundamentally believe that blockchains, if we allow them to play out in the way we want, can become the financial fabric of the future of finance, right? So in the future, instead of having all these intermediaries, very slow, untransparent or opaque middlemen and systems, entities, we can instead have a system which is more transparent, which is more efficient, and which is more meritocratic in different ways. But I don't think that this future gets created by itself. I think that you need people like founders and teams and contributors in different forms to actually dedicate a lot of their time to make sure that that future gets realized. And I don't think the transparency component of that happens by itself. In fact, this was reinforced last year, right? Where you had a lot of projects that, because they were not transparent, ended up aggregating a lot of risk in the system. And so I think FTX is a classic example where you don't have enough transparency of what's going on. And because of that, you build up a lot of risk, and at some point the whole thing collapses, and it has a lot of collateral damage to the whole ecosystem. And 2022 being not a great year for crypto was in some ways a reminder of why we created the company, because you need to have transparency in this industry. And so definitely that was being able to contribute to that future being realized was the ultimate kind of purpose of why we started the company. And then there are some, let's say, simpler reasons as well why we created the company. There was a market need for better analytics tools at the time when we created the company. Most of the analytics products that existed were focused on things like anti-money laundering or compliance. You didn't really have great on-chain analytics tools for investors. So that meant that most investors back then had to use Etherscan and manually try to navigate that. And as much as I love Etherscan, like, it's not a complete tool to help you surface the signal, right? So there was a market need for it. And then the final component, as with any startup initiative, is that you need builders or founders who can build that product that we think will solve this problem. And so myself and my 2 co-founders, Lars and Evgeny, were all data people. My background is data science and AI. Lars is a data engineer. Evgeny is a software engineer with a heavy inclination towards data. So the 3 of us, we had a strong sense that with our experience, we could actually pull this off and build this product. There was also one quite specific product insight we had, which was that some people think that because public blockchains are public, you can just go and query it for any information you want. But there's a lot of analytical queries that you can't just run because you don't have the contextual information of who owns which wallet. So that was what we refer to as attribution, where you try to associate a specific wallet to an entity, right? You give it a name or you give it some attributes, and that allows you to answer things like how many tokens are currently sitting on exchanges. The only way you can know that is if you attribute addresses to exchanges. So that was also a key insight, which we decided to dedicate a lot of our effort towards. And now we have, I think, around 250 million addresses labeled up. We cover about 85% of all transactional volume on the blockchains that we support. And so that just allowed investors and various different crypto operators to better understand what's happening on the blockchain in real time. So to make better investment decisions, to better understand your ecosystem as a builder or as an operator. And so, yeah, that's why we created it.
So what are the key, because you were so successful so fast, so what would you say were the few key factors that make you so successful so fast? Is it because you built something for yourself first?
Yeah.
Is it because obviously there was a bull market?
Yeah.
Was there like some specific moments or things in this bull market that made the difference?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I think we were scratching our own itch. Definitely. We were building for ourselves. And so we didn't just have this kind of product and then try to find a problem to solve with that product.
Yeah.
It wasn't a case of having the hammer and looking for the nails. It was like, people needed something like this to understand where the smart money was flowing, what tokens they were buying, who was yield farming what, and so on. So that was starting with the actual need and a problem was one part. The other part was, of course, the market conditions. This was, we launched in April 2020.
Yeah.
You would know like better than anyone that DeFi summer was insane in the sense that it's really when I think on-chain became really important. So there's a timing component to it where in the past people were trading on Binance, Coinbase and so on, but now people were trading on DEXs, they were yield farming, there was way more activity on-chain. And so no doubt that there was a timing component to it. Maybe the third thing I would say is that we managed to build the data platform in such a way that it was very easy for us to ship new stuff fast. And so when the NFT craze started the year after, that was a very different thing, but we were able to ship NFT dashboards very fast. And that became an even bigger growth catalyst than DeFi was for us. And so I think we tripled our revenue base in like 6 weeks after launching our NFT features in 2021. And one thing is to have a flexible data platform, but the other thing is to stay very crypto native and to be part of the ecosystem where your customers are. And so looking at NFTs and saying, hey, this is real. It's not just a small blip in the crypto ecosystem. It's a big thing. And a lot of people want to get more insights on NFTs. So deciding to prioritize that and shipping the dashboards and being able to ship the dashboards very fast was key. So I think those are some of the elements.
Yeah. So basically the timing and then obviously being able to ship and to be very flexible on the way you build the thing so you can, because this industry is so fast paced that basically you need to be able to follow it or even lead it and understand where the next trend is coming from to be able and build for it.
Like staying curious basically is really important in crypto and not dismissing stuff and saying, hey, this is just a JPEG. There's nothing interesting there. Looking at that a bit more and acknowledging that this could be really big if you extrapolate it. So I think curiosity is a key part of it.
Great. So maybe for people who are not super familiar with all this on-chain stuff, so why is the blockchain and more specifically on-chain data so important?
So sometimes people complain that they learn about trends or the latest token and whatnot too late. They hear it from someone else. Maybe someone's writing an article, they're sharing on Twitter. A lot of it is like secondhand information. But the nice thing about the blockchain is that's where the transactions actually happen. So if you know how to monitor the blockchain, you can get first-hand information. You don't need someone else to tell you about something. You can just literally see the transaction as it happens. And so an example of this would be when people started minting Bored Apes. I can't remember the exact month. I think it was June 2021, something like that. I'm pretty sure it was 2021 at least. Around that time, maybe it was May. I was using Nansen at the time, and I could see people minting Bored Apes because the network was getting congested. People were minting and increasing the gas prices. And you just see this pop up in our section called hot contracts. So it's a smart contract that a lot of people are using, and it's taking up a lot of bandwidth on the Ethereum network. And so I didn't need someone to tell me Bored Apes is happening, because I could just see it on the blockchain. And so I go in and try to figure out what's going on. And I did mint a couple of Bored Apes myself. Unfortunately, I sold them way too early. But that's the canonical example where you can see firsthand. You don't have to rely on secondhand information. Also, when it's firsthand, you don't need to worry so much about things like bias or people shilling you stuff, which is potentially a risk with secondhand information. I'm not saying you shouldn't use secondhand information. You definitely should. But the fact that you can just observe stuff like on chain is really, that's a key attribute of blockchains. And maybe the second thing is that if you compare it to traditional finance, the data that you look at in traditional finance is typically aggregated at a very high level. Whereas with the blockchain, you can look down at the individual transactions.
Yeah.
So you can go really deep. And that allows you to discover new stuff. It allows you to perform due diligence on what different entities are doing, what's happening with a specific project, and to basically stay on top of things. If someone's selling a token that you own, that's something you should probably know about as soon as possible.
So very specific example for people in the industry and traders, basically. We're still very focused on. So we talked a bit about that before, but so how is it possible that despite the blockchain promise of transparency and fairness, all we manage as an industry is to, not all, but a lot of what we manage to do as an industry is to recreate the traditional financial system shenanigans and maybe do even worse? So how can we explain that basically? Is it greed? Is it, I don't know, like people with bad intentions? What happened? And could we see this coming? Or I remember last time we met, you were saying, oh, I know in the next 6 months to 1 year is going to be this 90% crash. It's going to happen. We just don't know when and what for. No one expected it would be as bad in terms of maybe not prices, but like entities, like key entities blowing up. So how can we explain that basically?
Yes, it's a hard question. I guess thinking out loud on this, I do think that it's important to acknowledge that crypto is still a very young industry. Those of us who are in crypto might feel like it's been here forever, but literally we're talking 5-6 years ago, since say 2017, when you practically had nothing in terms of actual applications, protocols that people were using on the blockchain. So the fact that it's very young and immature means that it's easy to exploit and take advantage of many of the participants in the space, because we haven't built up that robustness yet, right? So I think the optimistic take is that you were saying before we started recording that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And there is like an element of anti-fragility with crypto, where like you just throw bad shit at it, and then over time it gets more robust.
Yeah.
And so I think it just hasn't had enough time to develop robustness, because literally it's a very young industry. And so the optimistic take is that the more bad stuff like this happens, the more resilient it gets over time. And of course, Bitcoin, you can talk about the technology of Bitcoin and how I think of it as like a proof of concept almost, technology-wise. Bitcoin maximalists, won't like that description, of course, but what you have to give it credit for is that it's been around the longest. So it has this kind of Lindy effect. It still works. It's secure, right? And so this is a really great attribute of Bitcoin. And so the same thing will happen with other crypto projects, right? Some protocols, tokens, and so on will die out. They won't survive different movements. And other ones will survive. And partially it's because they are robust and they're constantly getting bombarded with threats, which is why something like, if you think about exploits, right, of DeFi protocols or people doing financial engineering or economical engineering to exploit different protocols, you might see that as a negative, but I think it is something that adds to the antifragility of the whole ecosystem, right? So you have to then, if someone like exploits, was it Mango or something like, that's a lesson learned for us. And then next time you build a protocol like that, you have to make sure that you can withstand an attack like that. And similarly with FTX, next time people send funds to an exchange, they're going to be more demanding with regards to the transparency they will want to see, proof of solvency, proof of reserves, proof of liabilities, and so on. So I think overall what it comes down to is just it's a very young industry, and you need to just consistently bombard it with stuff, and over time it will get more robust.
So basically the biggest reminder is, even if, especially in a bull market, everybody's like talking about super cycle or talking about is the next huge thing and like it's just gonna go from here, like it's still probably much earlier than what most people think, and probably still for some time.
Yeah.
So the next time, it's easier to say now than when things are super frothy, but the next time everything is going super frothy again, just reminding that it's still very young and it's still very early, and it's probably going to maybe have more kind of 10 to 20 to 30 years view, because the internet also took a lot of time to like really develop.
Absolutely. I've seen people ask questions like, when the internet was new, did you have this many scams as you have in crypto? And it's a good question. I think in reality, if you think about crypto already has the internet. So it's a mecca for scammers in a way, because you have the benefit of having the internet, which is by the way, scams happen. I feel like actually there are more scams on the internet now than it was 10 years ago. I don't know if that's true, but there are all sorts of different avenues and clever things you can do as a scammer. But then on the internet, besides crypto, but then you add a transactional layer to that's permissionless as well. And you get an explosion of like scammers and bad things happening. And then people will have different philosophies on this. Some people will feel like you need more consumer protection, you need to intervene earlier, and to prevent all the bad things. But of course, if you do that, you will also slow down innovation.
Absolutely.
So there's a trade-off. And this is literally something that you can try to find that optimum, but people will have different political views, for example, on how to think about that. Do you want to optimize for more freedom, to accept that some people are going to get hurt, or you have to break some eggs to make an omelet? Or do you want to take the approach that we want to protect people at all costs, but that means you probably won't have much innovation? Then you probably get a system that's more like banks today, right? Which are, generally speaking, quite secure, but there's zero innovation, right?
What do you think the priorities now for politicians out there? Probably depends on the countries, but like even what happened, for example, Singapore is a good example, saying Singaporean, you cannot use Binance, forcing people into FTX, with even Temasek investing in FTX, and then you see this happening and it was the wrong, so they look pretty bad. Like probably there is going to be a tendency to overcorrect now. So how do you think about the different kind of regulators?
So I think Singapore, the regulators in Singapore, first of all, are actually very educated on the topic of crypto. I've interacted with some of the leaders directly, and they're definitely very thoughtful and nuanced. They were a little bit unlucky with some of the decisions they made. When you're picking winners, you will always have the risk that you pick the wrong entities. And the situation with Binance was actually a little bit more nuanced, because as far as I understand, it wasn't like an outright ban. There was I think there was alleged solicitation, meaning that you tried to market towards Singaporeans. This is how I understand it. It might not be 100% correct. And that somehow led to Binance having to block traffic from Singapore. And the result, yes, was basically that many people went to FTX instead. And then we can talk about how that happened and what would be, there should be like a post-mortem as a regulator, like how did that happen and how can we prevent that from happening in the future? I do think that Singapore generally tries to take a nuanced approach. They see a lot of the benefits of blockchains, but they are also quite skeptical towards the idea of local retail investors losing money.
Yeah.
And many of them lost money with FTX. So that's where the end result didn't quite match their intention in a way. So they tried to do certain things, but actually you ended up having a lot of local retail investors losing money. So what should regulators do? I think first of all, you have to regulate call it centralized entities, like start with the exchanges. And my suggestion to MAS here in Singapore was basically you should try to drive transparency of exchanges. And one very simple way to do this is to get them to disclose all of their addresses where they hold customer funds. This doesn't give you the full picture. It gives you a proof of reserves picture, but not proof of liabilities, which you also need. And they could submit that separately, perhaps to regulators, or transparently with some third-party auditor to help them get proof of solvency, which is ultimately what you care about. But as a start, anyone who gets a license to run an exchange in Singapore, why not ask them to disclose pretty much in real time all the addresses that they control or they custody funds? That's something it was September last year, a couple of months before FTX. Of course, it takes a little bit of time to roll something like that out. I'm not sure if they will do it. But increasing transparency, I think, is something that you actually have to force centralized entities to do. I hope that you see some self-regulation in the industry too, where some exchanges, like they jump in and
They
try to...
They had to, given how bad it was. And you guys did a really good job actually at Nansen to like providing infrastructure to do that. But they had to because you didn't want to be the next one to have all these capital flights.
Yeah.
Obviously. But it was also, I would say, the capital flight should not be a reason for the exchange to go insolvent. So it's like this.
Yeah. In theory, that it shouldn't be possible to do a bank run on an exchange because you're supposed to have more than 100% of all the customer funds. In that sense, this is what CZ will say. Of course, it's not good for their business when people withdraw, but go ahead, do it because they have all the customer funds available. At least that's what they tell us.
Yeah.
So this was a stress test. And of course, FTX failed that stress test quite dramatically. But it's generally in their interest to be transparent because that means people don't have that fear and they will choose to leave their funds on their exchange. And if the funds are on the exchange, it's a lot easier for the exchange to get those traders to actually trade. Yeah, it's in their interest to be transparent. So I think you need a bit of carrot and you need a bit of stick. Like you would like to incentivize the exchanges so they realize it's a good thing for them to be transparent. The market can self-regulate. But you also, I think, should see regulators be a bit more proactive on this front. And instead of, I personally don't, from a kind of moral or ethical or political perspective, I don't think the right focus is to try to block retail investors from doing stuff. Because to me, it doesn't sit well with me that someone, just because they don't have $1 million in their bank account, they're not allowed to access certain investment opportunities. Yeah. To me, that's not meritocratic. But what you should do is try to protect that retail investor to make sure they don't get defrauded by an exchange. So the emphasis should be on making sure that these entities that are very important and that have a centralized point of failure, they are incorporated in a specific jurisdiction and so on, to make sure that they are running their business in a responsible manner,
Yeah.
while at the same time not overburdening them with paperwork and so on. That's why I think the proposal of have them disclose their addresses is actually really simple for them to do, but it adds a lot of transparency and it protects the consumers and retail investors.
Yeah, so it's basically being a bit less focused on the retail investors, which probably is much easier, and more on like the potential source of the problem.
Exactly. I don't think it's, you can have different political, moral, ethical views on this topic. Should you have a nanny state that sort of decides, are you actually capable of making your own decisions or not? Personally, I would opt towards freedom. I think many people in crypto value freedom a lot, and you should give people a chance to screw up themselves.
Yeah.
But
That's
yeah,
how you learn.
but
the hard way.
But if you're like a political leader, that can also add more kind of volatility to your jurisdiction. So it's safer to keep people in their lane, happy with their 2% interests that they're getting from the bank or whatever, instead of going 10,000% APY on some yield farming protocol.
Yeah, absolutely. Given what happened, basically a fair chunk of your customers are traders, and at least given the model you had before all this kind of mess, and a lot of traders and institutions blew up last year. So how do you deal with the potential huge revenue swings? Because this industry is by nature so volatile, and even like how do you deal with kind of justifying a substantial valuation that you got near a market top? How do you deal with this?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things here. The first one is, initially when we started, we were very retail investor heavy. Or when I say retail investor, it's actually not someone who bought Bitcoin for the first time last week. It would be more like a retail investor, maybe like you and me. People who are, we spend quite a lot of time on crypto. So we're relatively sophisticated, right? But we're still individual investors, right? That was our core market, and it's still the biggest chunk of our customer base. But in the last year or 18 months, we've started focusing increasingly on the B2B customer segment. So operators in the crypto space as well as funds. And so one way to get more resilient to market swings is to have more B2B customers, basically. And so I think a year or 18 months ago, we had something like 20% of our revenues coming from B2B. Now we have more like 60%.
Okay.
So there's definitely a healthy growth of getting more institutional and business customers on board. And there's more kind of inertia and there's more long-term thinking of businesses, right? Because you and I can just take a break from crypto and not invest in the next year or 2 years. But if you have a business, you're still running that business, you still need help to understand, get insights on your ecosystem. Or if you're a fund, you can't just stop investing, right? You still want to understand what's happening with your portfolio, where else can you invest? So that's one thing we've done. The other thing is to broaden to segments, like I was saying, to operators as well. Initially, it was all investor focused, but now we also help operators. So if you think about NFT marketplaces, if you think about exchanges, stablecoin issuers, there's actually a lot of interesting insights they can get from our data because we have the best blockchain data in the world, annotated and attributed with 250 million labeled addresses. And it's cross-chain, like we have support for lots of different blockchains that they can look at. So instead of them building out that in-house, which will cost them a lot of money, they can basically subscribe to our data sets and run their own analysis based on that. So this is something that can actually save them costs, right? If they try to build it up from scratch, it will cost more, it will take a longer time. But coming to us and us having all the data, all the infrastructure, as well as having research analysts who can sometimes help them with queries and different things, dashboards, that's something that helps us. So those two things, like shifting or rather focusing more on B2B, first of all, and then focusing in addition to the operators, on the operator segment, in addition to the investor segment, those are probably the two main things we've done.
Okay, awesome. So what's your focus now and like plan to survive this bear market?
as I mentioned before, I got laid off in 2018 when I think started that year. ETH was $1,400, and I got laid off at $80, I think, like 11 months or 10 months later. So I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of a company that doesn't make it through a bear market. So that means I was always quite mindful of making sure that we could make long-term commitments to our team members. And we do have a large treasury. Like we have a multi-year runway, even in a disaster scenario in terms of revenues. So survival is not really something we have to think that much about. We've already handled that, at least for the next 4+ years. So then you have to ask, like, how do you thrive, right, in this market? And it comes back to what I was saying, where you try to focus on B2B, you focus on operators, and then, of course, making sure that you are, I think, focused on the right playing field. So thinking more about strategy. And this is something I've spent a lot of time in the last year, both trying to flesh out our own strategy internally as a company and our own product strategy, and also then communicating that to our team so that they can make great decisions day to day and week to week. And so one mistake I think I made was that we went a bit too broad in our product surface area. For example, we made a messaging platform called Nansen Connect,
Yes.
which I still think is a fascinating idea. But we also realized that, hey, this is adding a lot of surface area for our product. And is this distracting us too much? And this year we've decided to pull back a bit on that. It's still going to be live and people can still use it, but it's not an area where we are investing at the moment. We don't really have engineering and product resources allocated to it, except for basic maintenance. So focusing on the 4 areas where we are really good is one thing we want to do. So analytics, that's where we started. We are number 1 there, but we want to really become the definitive number 1 in that category for on-chain analytics. Portfolio tracking is another thing that we want to be number 1 at. We acquired a company called Apeboard last year. We rolled out Nansen Portfolio, where you can plug in wallets from 45 different blockchains and get your overview. That's actually how we were able to do the kind of reserves tracking of exchanges, because we could just take their wallets, plug it in there, and then 20 minutes later, they have their own portfolio overview of all their customer funds. Portfolio tracking, we want to be number 1 on. And then research is another area where we have received a lot of positive feedback. If you look at our research pieces on FTX, on Luna or UST, on staked Ether, Celsius, 3 Arrows. There's a lot of different things we've written research on. And frankly, when I meet people, often they talk about our research, like how much they like the research we do. So we're doubling down on that with our research portal, which people can check out at research.nansen.ai. And then the 4th category, where we will have an announcement in February, is around blockchain data. So being able, giving teams the chance to work directly with our data to create the insights and analyses and dashboards, etc., that they want themselves. So those 4 areas, analytics, portfolio, tracking, research, and data, that's where we really want to focus and not get too distracted by all the other cool things we could do. Just make sure that we have a 10x better product at the end of the year. And of course, we have different key bets and so on within that we want to focus on. But if you're a Nansen customer at the end of this year, you should feel like the product is just 10x better. You're paying the same for it, but it's a 10x better product. And when we expanded really fast, right, in terms of headcount, we went from 9 people to 150 people in 18 months, right, which is insane. That means you have to slow down a little bit on the output because you're just onboarding a lot of people, training them. But this year we're going to hire much less, and that allows us to focus more on having a stable organization and then just executing and delivering value for our customers. I'm actually super excited about this year. I think this year, if you're a Nansen customer, you're going to be absolutely delighted by all the great work that's done. And we will have a chance to just produce more output instead of spending a lot of time like ramping up the organization.
Awesome. So basically, in a nutshell, you are organized and prepared to not survive, but basically be very offensive during the bear market. So you can deliver and actually bring a lot of value.
I don't talk about this so much, but I do think that this year will be quite PvP on many different fronts. And frankly, one thing I expect us to do is to grow our market share in all those 4 categories. We don't really have any, I would say we don't have any direct competitors as a whole, because Nansen is pretty much the only platform player that does all these 4 things. But we do have what you can consider competitors in each specific quadrant, like portfolio tracking. There are companies doing that. On-chain analytics, there's companies doing that. Crypto research, companies doing that. But there aren't any companies doing all of those 4 in one unified way. And so what I expect to see this year is that we grow our market shares. And that means that there isn't a PvP element to that, which is unfortunate. You'd want just the pie to grow and everyone can thrive. But in reality, I think there's going to be a lot of blood this year. We're going to be focused on ourselves, of course, like creating a product that's just the best product. But if I don't see an increase in market share on traffic, on revenues, and so on, that's going to be disappointing. I expect us to grow a lot in terms of market share. And I don't know if that means we will grow in absolute terms or not. That depends a lot on the market conditions.
Okay, awesome. Let's just finish with a few personal questions. Crypto is very intense as an industry. It's 24/7. People make and lose fortunes overnight. So how do you deal with mental health in this space, both as an investor and as a founder?
So when you work in a space that's so volatile and has so much chaos, I think you need to overcompensate the other way around on the stuff you can control. So my calendar is very rigid. In fact, maybe this is part of an issue on why we struggled to find a time to do this interview. But so that means I know pretty much how my week is going to look week to week. And that just gives me a lot of comfort. I mostly wear the same clothes every day. And so that also adds stability. I think my life from the outside is very boring, perhaps, just in terms of my rhythm. But I kind of have this belief that in life, you need to have certain anchors. So you can think of yourself as a boat on a sea, right? And you need to have an anchor that keeps you from drifting everywhere. And so then you can choose what do you want to put in that anchor. For example, having a fixed place to live is an anchor. Having a fixed job is an anchor. Having a relationship is an anchor. Having specific hobbies, routines, these are all anchors. And then, of course, you can't have, if you have too much anchors, you get stuck, right, in just one place. So you have to balance it so you can drift a little bit around. And in this industry, you get pulled everywhere because the sea is very wild. And so I try to make sure that I have enough stuff in my anchor so I don't drift too much. There's also an element of where you are in your life. I'm in my mid-30s, so probably I will optimize for more staying in the stable space. When you're in your mid-20s, you might want to have a little bit less weight in your anchor and float around more. So this is something I've thought about for many years. I try to make sure I have a healthy balance of my anchor and giving me some freedom to move around. If you lose something in your anchor, you have to typically get something else in there, right? So if you have a breakup, you have to maybe consider taking some other part of your life and making that more stable, etc. So it's a framework that I've used a lot.
So how much of a space has your physical shape in this kind of boat or anchor thing? Like how much do you focus on that, or it's something that's not important to you?
What do you mean by physical?
I'm saying basically doing sport and
Yeah,
all
exactly.
that
Yeah,
stuff.
so I have like a personal trainer. I go twice to the gym a week. I'm definitely not as fit as I would like to be, but I do think it is really important. Even when you're past your 30s, you start to get weird pains in your body. And so like I've had a lot of lower back pains and I couldn't figure out why. And then I started lifting weights and somehow I got better. There's stuff like that, which I think is quite important. And yeah, taking care of your body, it's something you don't think about in your 20s, just kind of everything works. And then past your 30s, you have to start thinking much more about it. My mother's also a physiotherapist. So the mindset has always been that like physical activity is my medicine.
Mm.
So yeah, taking care of yourself is important.
And if maybe to finish, so how did this industry, which is really crazy, and you're someone very hungry and passionate as a founder, how did this impact your personal relationships?
I mean, I did go through a divorce when I started Nansen, actually. So there is a very tangible impact there. And definitely, it wasn't helped by the fact that I was basically working all the time. That's not great, but yeah.
You wouldn't say it's the main cause of the, like the overworking and...
Hard to say.
Okay.
I would say large component without getting too personal on different things here. But I think it was a large component. But largely I've met a lot of great people. I would say overall, my life has never been better than it is what it is right now. So I think definitely net positive in terms of an impact the work and the industry has had on my life. But it is very much, crypto is a space where you have to learn to take care of yourself. That kind of goes back to your question on mental health and so on. And so taking that seriously, I think is important. There isn't necessarily someone out for you. So you have to take care of yourself. And of course, we have to take care of each other. I've worked at some great companies where you have a manager, you have an HR department that will look out for you and perhaps give you a heads up if you're working too much. Whereas in crypto, you're on your own in many cases, unless you happen to work at a company where you have some of those frames around you and the supporting mechanisms. But I do think that we like to be tough on like crypto Twitter and so on, but it's very important to take mental health and physical health seriously.
Yeah, there's actually probably a lot of pretty miserable people on crypto Twitter because of how crazy this industry is, and also like the kind of character that it attracts probably more people who are in their room or spend too much time on the computer and don't touch enough grass, as they say.
Also, one thing which is quite practical that has worked well for me in my life is I'm an OKRs maximalist. So OKR stands for objectives and key results. This is a very simple way to set goals for like your startup, company, or project. But I also use that for my personal life. So every quarter I set typically maximum 3 objectives, and then I associate some key results with that. So one of my personal objectives this quarter is less screen time, more read time. So monitoring like how much time I spend on my phone, for example, on Twitter. There's actually some nice functionality within iPhones where you can monitor your screen time.
Yeah.
So if you're like a data person like me, that helps to have a bit of frames and a framework around it.
If there was a summary or key takeaway that people should remember from today, what would it be?
We're all going to make it. No. I would say maybe have some perspective on the whole industry. So right now, like we're recording this at a relatively gloomy time, but we've been through gloomy times before in crypto. And when you zoom out, I do think that blockchains will become the financial fabric of the future. And the only way it happens is if people work towards that. So just making sure that you have that long-term perspective and you focus on how you can contribute to the space without getting discouraged by the different market cycles. Just make sure that you have a plan and you have a strategy. either personally or for your project, and then it's probably going to work out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Alex. Where can the audience find you and connect with you?
Probably on Twitter. Svanevik is my handle. Look for a pudgy penguin. And of course, people can go to nansen.ai to try out our product.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you everyone for listening and watching. Please smash the like button and give us your feedback in the comments. Highlights will be posted on YouTube, Twitter, Substack, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So follow us there to get exclusive access to some special content and promo codes. And I'll see you all in the next episode.